Beneath the surface of human history lie fragments of forgotten worlds, traces of civilizations whose knowledge and rituals have vanished into time. These mysteries defy simple explanations: stone circles, vanished peoples, symbols that seem to be written in the language of another era. Each riddle is a window into the past, a hint of lost meanings awaiting decipherment. The mystery of the Sarong stone circles. Deep in the humid tropical lands of Sarong, where thick fog still obscures the outlines of the hills, stand stone circles that have long been one of the most perplexing mysteries of antiquity. They stretch in a chain through forest clearings, sometimes emerging on barely perceptible hills. Locals believe them to be the remains of forgotten peoples who lived long before the emergence of known cultures in the region. Researchers note the remarkable state of preservation of the structures. The stones are virtually undamaged, as if the environment itself were protecting them. The first descriptions of these circles mentioned smooth lines between the stone blocks, which seemed unusual for an area where the humid climate quickly erases any traces of careful carving. Each circle consists of large vertical slabs embedded so deeply in the ground that attempts to determine their original height are inaccurate. Geologists emphasize that the stone blocks themselves are taken from a rock not found in the immediate vicinity. This means that ancient builders moved the massive slabs over significant distances using methods that left no trace. Searchers for ancient roads have attempted to discover traces of tracks or drag marks, but the soil of Sarong remains silent. All that remains are the stones themselves, as if deliberately left as a message to future generations. The arrangement of the circles is particularly noteworthy. Some researchers believe they form a single line, slightly offset from ancient star risings. Comparisons with celestial maps revealed coincidences that are difficult to dismiss as random. However, due to the lack of written sources, it is impossible to say with certainty whether the circle creators observed the sky or used these coordinates as part of a ritual scheme. Archaeoastronomers emphasize that such coincidences are not unique to this site. Many ancient structures around the world are aligned with celestial bodies. However, the Sarong stones are unique in that their precision exceeds what would be expected for a culture about which we know nothing. Upon closer inspection, the stone surfaces are covered with microscopic lines. They don't resemble inscriptions or symbols, but rather traces of work with an unknown tool. The stones appear polished, yet their natural relief is preserved. This creates the impression that the craftsman wanted to preserve the natural form, removing only a thin surface layer. Experts in ancient technology have attempted to replicate this technique using stone and wooden tools, but the results are significantly inferior to the Sarong examples. This raises the question, did the builders possess knowledge that we don't see in other monuments in the region? The interior of the circles is also controversial. Some researchers believe they served as ceremonial sites, where rituals related to observing natural cycles took place. Others believe they were points where ancient inhabitants recorded seasonal transitions, allowing them to better manage their agriculture. The problem is that there is nothing inside the circles that would provide a direct explanation. No traces of fires, no remains of pottery, no funerary rituals. The entire space is perfectly clean, as if it had been meticulously cleaned or had never been used for domestic purposes. Sarong legends tell of a people who came from afar and disappeared, leaving behind only stones as a memento of their travels. According to these tales, the circles are anchors of their spirit, allowing them to connect with the world of stars. Scholars regard such stories as cultural heritage, but acknowledge that sometimes legends contain a grain of truth about real events. Perhaps these circles were indeed part of a ritual practice based on observing the sky as reflected in their orientation. One of the boldest hypotheses links the circles to a knowledge transfer system. Unusual resonance effects have been detected within some structures. Sound emitted in the center of the circle is amplified and changes hue. Researchers suggest that the builders knew the properties of these stones and created acoustic zones where sound was transformed into a special vibrational phenomenon. In ancient cultures, vibrations were often associated with meditative practices or immersion in an altered state of consciousness. However, there is no direct evidence of such a function, only observations of physical effects. In some areas, the soil around the circles has a different chemical composition. Some speculate that special plants used in rituals grew there. However, this remains mere conjecture. The climate was constantly changing, and it is impossible to determine precisely what plants existed at that time. Nevertheless, the unusual soil patterns reinforce the impression that the circles were part of a complex system connecting stone, earth, sky, and people. Despite numerous studies, there is no definitive explanation for the origin of these structures. The sarong stone circles remain an open book, each page written not with ink, but with the shadow of the past. They combine precision, mystery, and apparent simplicity that conceals profound meaning. The more scientists learn about them, the more questions arise. Perhaps their purpose was multi-layered, sacred, astronomical, and social all at once. Thus, the stone circles continue to stand in the green mist of Sarong, as if watching us and waiting for the moment when we learn to ask the right questions. After all, the true secrets of antiquity are revealed not to those who seek answers, but to those who know how to listen. Undeciphered symbols of Sujam. High on the harsh, rocky cliffs of Sujam, where the winds cut the air like invisible knives, lie mysterious symbols that have become one of the most perplexing mysteries of the ancient world. They appear on sheer walls, inaccessible without specialized equipment. When the first explorers saw these symbols, they were astonished not only by their placement, but also by the strange repetition of their patterns. The symbols seem to be etched into the stone with incredible precision, and it seems their creators sought to perpetuate some important knowledge understood only by them. The surface of the stone slabs bearing the symbols is smooth, as if specially prepared. This is not an ordinary rock base damaged by wind and rain. The stone appears to have been cleaned and smoothed with great effort. Experts speculate that ancient craftsmen knew processing techniques that allowed them to smooth the surface without severely damaging the structure. However, such work would have required considerable effort and time, as well as a clear understanding of the ultimate goal. The very arrangement of the symbols demonstrates that their creators were willing to climb to great heights to place the message where only the initiated would see it. The structure of the symbols resembles writing, but does not match any known system. Researchers have found approximately 30 basic signs, repeated in various combinations. Sometimes they form rows, sometimes arranged in circles or vertical columns. Moreover, each sign has a distinct shape, as if created using a template. Some believe this is an early form of sacred writing of the people who lived in the Sujam valleys. However, archaeological finds do not confirm the existence of a developed written culture in these areas. This suggests that the symbols may have belonged to an earlier, vanished society. Attempts to decipher the symbols have been ongoing for many years. Experts in ancient languages have compared the signs with scripts from neighboring regions, but have found no convincing matches. Other researchers have attempted to link the symbols to natural phenomena, believing they represent a pattern of stellar movements or a record of seasonal cycles. However, the strict geometry of the signs makes such connections too strained. Each combination appears deliberate, but the hidden meaning eludes them, as if the symbols were deliberately designed to confuse the observer. The technique used to engrave the symbols is particularly puzzling. The stone where the symbols were carved has an unusual texture, as if it had been burned rather than cut or scratched by some unknown method. Some surfaces have a faint sheen, reminiscent of heat marks. Mineralogists believe that exposure to high temperatures could have altered the stone's properties. But how the ancients could have created localized heat in hard-to-reach places remains a question that remains unanswered. Local legends tell of a people who knew how to manipulate stone so that it became as soft as clay. According to legend, these masters used a secret known only to priests. The markings on the rocks, according to the locals, are their rituals, preserved forever. Although legends cannot be taken as an exact description of events, they often contain elements that point to forgotten practices. Perhaps the ancients truly knew ways to temporarily alter the properties of stone, even if modern scientists cannot explain such technology. Interestingly, the Sujam symbols are not randomly arranged, but rather form a network spanning several cliffs. When viewed from above, the symbols appear to create invisible lines intersecting at specific angles. This has led some researchers to speculate that the symbols served as landmarks or markers for navigation over rugged terrain. But why, then, are they located so high up, where the path is dangerous even for experienced climbers? Several years ago, a detailed study of the shape and depth of the lines was conducted. It was found that each indentation had a uniform depth, which is impossible with conventional hand carving. This led to the hypothesis that a tool existed that could have created the signs with mathematical precision. However, not a single such tool has been found among the archaeological finds. Remarkably, there are no traces of even the slightest corrections. It appears as if each sign was perfectly executed the first time. Some researchers believe the symbols serve energetic rather than semantic purposes. This idea sounds unusual, but in some areas near the signs, a slight change in the magnetic field is recorded. Scientists attribute this to the natural properties of the rocks, but the coincidence with the locations of the symbols raises doubts. Perhaps the ancients knew more about the properties of stone than we think, and used them to create sites that influenced people in specific ways. Despite years of attempts to understand them, the symbols of Sujam remain silent witnesses of time. Their lines continue to draw the attention of those seeking the key to forgotten languages. They seem to promise to reveal their secret, but each time they lead the researcher astray, offering new insights. Perhaps understanding them requires a different approach, one that doesn't rely solely on logic and comparison, but considers the connection between humans and nature that once formed the foundation of ancient cultures. Thus, the symbols of Sujam continue to hang on the sheer walls as if carved by the hands of those who wish to speak to future generations. They remind us that not all knowledge can be measured or organized into diagrams. Some secrets remain hidden, not because we cannot read, but because the time has not yet come to hear their voice. Nakbe Underground Passages. Beneath the dense thickets of ancient Nakbe, hidden in the silence of the tropical forest, stretches a network of underground passages that remain one of the most intricate architectural mysteries of antiquity. When archaeologists first explored these lands, they discovered not just caves or natural fissures, but carefully crafted passages extending to considerable depths. Their structure resembles a vast labyrinth, with each gallery leading to a new fork. The ancient builders seem to have possessed an astonishing understanding of the behavior of soils, as the walls of these passages rarely collapse, despite the region's humid climate. The walls of most galleries are composed of carefully fitted stones. They don't form perfectly straight lines, but their geometry appears deliberate. The stones are arranged to distribute the load and support the vault, as if the builders intuitively understood the principles of balance. Some researchers believe the builders used a method based on observation of natural caves. They may have imitated the forms nature has created over centuries. This explains why the vaults remain intact even after long periods of flooding, typical in these areas during the seasonal rains. Particularly fascinating are the sections where the corridors divide into several levels. Such elevation changes appear too complex to be constructed by chance. In some places, the ceilings are constructed in such a way that sound reflecting off the stone creates a barely perceptible echo that lasts unusually long. Experts speculate that the ancients may have used such acoustic effects in rituals. In enclosed spaces, sound acquires a special depth, and its impact on a person is intensified. It's possible that the Nakbe passages served not only as means of transportation, but also as sacred spaces where rituals requiring isolation from the outside world took place. Despite their complexity, almost no traces of permanent human habitation have been found within the passages. There are no clay vessels, remains of fireplaces, or household items. This supports the idea that the passages served ritual or engineering rather than domestic purposes. It is hypothesized that they connected different parts of the ancient settlement, allowing priests and nobles to move undetected. However, no one can explain why such a large-scale network was created in such harsh soil conditions. The dampness and lack of ventilation make continuous use of the corridors difficult. Interestingly, the Nakbe passages in some places lead to underground halls that seem to widen in only one direction, forming unusual oval spaces. Their shape resembles elongated chambers where small groups of people could gather. The walls of these halls bear traces of processing and sometimes even almost invisible incisions. They don't resemble pictograms or symbols, but rather resemble the marks of a tool used to smooth the surface. Perhaps these halls were used to create a special atmosphere associated with darkness and echoes, immersing people in a state necessary for rituals. Some researchers suggest that the underground passages were a means of storing and distributing water. The region often experiences periods of intense rainfall followed by dry seasons. Under such conditions, water management would have been vital. It is believed that the corridors acted as channels, collecting moisture and directing it to central reservoirs. However, direct evidence of a hydraulic system has not yet been found, and the shape of the passages more closely resembles a space for movement than a reservoir. One of the most enigmatic features of Nakbe is the absence of major landslides. Even sections built in loose rock remain stable. This speaks to a profound understanding of local conditions. Perhaps the builders used a stone-laying pattern that allowed them to stabilize the walls without the use of binders. This method is known in various ancient cultures, but at Nakbe it is especially masterfully executed. The stones seem to breathe with the soil, adapting to its changes. Observations show that some passages are oriented relative to the cardinal directions. This raises speculation about their connection to astronomical cycles. If the ancients truly constructed the network with such reference points in mind, it could have served as a kind of map or model of the world as they understood it. For many cultures, underground space symbolized the path to truths hidden from ordinary view. Perhaps the Nakbe passages represented the material embodiment of this idea, creating a space where people felt separated from everyday life. There's also a theory that the passages may have been used for initiation. Young members of the community embarking on their path of initiation would pass through the underground darkness, encountering silence and the unknown. This experience may have strengthened their sense of unity with the tribe and its traditions. The underworld was often seen as a place where people connect with the spirits of their ancestors. Therefore, the passages may have been part of a whole system of rituals that strengthened the bond between generations. Despite attempts to explain the passage's origin and purpose, they remain a mystery. Each researcher sees their own interpretation: an engineering solution, a religious space, a hidden network of passages, or even an element of ancient mythology embodied in stone. But no one can say for sure which version is closer to the truth. The Nakbe underground passages live their own lives, hidden from light and time, as if preserving in stone the breath of those who walked through them in ancient times. Thus, this network continues to reach deep into the earth, inviting those willing to listen to its silence. Perhaps one day its secret will be revealed. But, like many mysteries of the past, Nakbe reminds us that the path to understanding always begins with respect for those who built the world differently from us. Stone platforms of Palmela. On the high hills of Palmela, where the sea breeze rises up the rocky slopes and mingles with the scent of warm earth, lie mysterious platforms that have sparked debate for decades. Their massive outlines are hidden beneath layers of vegetation, but where the undergrowth recedes, smooth stone surfaces resembling enormous terraces are revealed. It seems these platforms served as foundations for structures, but no traces of buildings have been found on them. All indications are that the platforms were conceived as independent structures with an important, yet still unexplained, purpose. Each platform consists of large blocks, perfectly fitted together. No traces of adhesives were found, and everything is held together by the precision of the installation. The blocks are of varying shapes, but where they meet, they create a barely perceptible line. This mastery of craftsmanship is remarkable, as the local stone is difficult to smooth. Some geologists believe that ancient craftsmen used a method of gradually heating and cooling the stone to achieve smooth surfaces. This method requires precise knowledge of the behavior of minerals, suggesting a high level of craftsmanship rarely found in ancient structures in the region. The surface of the platforms bears fine lines, as if left by a tool or implement that could have glided across the stone. However, these marks do not resemble damage or scratches. They are too straight, too uniform, as if they served as landmarks or markings. Researchers note that some lines converge at identical angles on different platforms, suggesting they are connected within a single system. Perhaps the ancient builders used these landmarks for astronomical observations, aligning points through which sunlight or moonlight would pass. However, direct evidence of such a purpose is not yet available. Interestingly, the platforms are located at different heights, creating a sequence of ascents. From below, they appear as steps leading to the top of the hill. This form is reminiscent of cult complexes known to various ancient peoples, where ascent symbolized the transition from the human world to the spirit world. But in Palmela, there are no carved stones, no altars, no images indicating a religious purpose. Here, only empty, austere surfaces await their lost meaning. Some scholars believe the platforms may have been used for sea observation. Their top points offer views of the coastline, and on a clear day, the horizon can be discerned. Perhaps the ancient builders were creating a system of observation posts to monitor the movements of ships. But that raises the question, why were such massive and labor-intensive structures required? Simple stone platforms or embankments could have served the same function. However, the Palmela platforms are distinguished by their scale and sophistication, as if they served a purpose far greater than mere observation. It has been suggested that the platforms were part of a larger engineering complex designed to collect rainwater. Their flat surfaces could have directed water to specially created depressions or reservoirs. The region is often subject to periods of drought, and this method of water storage could have been an important element in the existence of ancient settlements. However, no channels or traces of water collection structures have been found around the platforms. Moreover, the platforms themselves are too clear of the sediments typical of such systems. This makes the water collection hypothesis interesting, but not well-founded. The largest platform, located near the top of the hill, evokes a special feeling. Its surface is so smooth that it appears artificially polished. In certain lighting conditions, the stone reflects light, creating a barely noticeable sheen. Some researchers wonder whether this feature could have been used in rituals requiring the presence of light. Perhaps the surface served as a kind of mirror, amplifying the sun's rays. But why then is the platform so large if such a function could have been performed by a small area? Archives contain accounts of travelers encountering local residents who until recently avoided climbing these stone platforms. They considered them to be places belonging to their ancestors and claimed to hear footsteps there, even when no one was there. Such legends often accompany ancient structures, especially if their purpose remains unclear. And although the scientific explanation for such stories is linked to acoustic effects arising from the shape of the hill, the enigmatic attitude of the locals toward the platforms adds an aura of mystery. Observations show that at certain points on the platforms, sound does indeed behave unusually. Rustling sounds are amplified, and footsteps create a louder echo than expected from an open space. Perhaps the stones are arranged in such a way as to create specific resonant zones that amplify the sounds. This evokes parallels with ancient religious buildings in other regions, where acoustics played an important role in rituals. However, at Palmela, there is not a single element that directly confirms the presence of rituals. Everything remains at the level of conjecture and comparison. A particularly interesting element are the recesses hidden along the edges of the platforms. They are small niches carved into the stone. Their origin is unknown. They are too small for storing objects and too neat to be natural erosion remains. Some speculate that wooden posts could have been installed in them, supporting lightweight structures. The platforms would then have been the foundations of long-vanished buildings. But if so, why did these structures leave no trace, even though the surrounding stone is perfectly preserved? Another hypothesis links the platforms to an ancient measurement system. They may have served as vast platforms for creating maps, drawing lines, or performing calculations related to the movements of celestial bodies. The lines on the surface may be part of such a system. However, this theory requires assuming that the inhabitants of Palmela possessed knowledge superior to their neighbors, and there is no archaeological evidence for this. Nevertheless, researchers continue to find traces of strict geometry in the arrangement of the platforms, as if each one were part of a single plan. Despite decades of scientific research, the mystery of Palmela's stone platforms remains unsolved. Their shapes, arrangement, workmanship, and strange acoustic properties form a picture in which each element is significant, but none explains the whole. Perhaps these structures were part of a sacred complex that required no walls, statues, or altars. Perhaps they were places of power where ancient people observed the world, connecting with nature through stone and light. Or perhaps they were engineering platforms created for unknown practical purposes. Today, the platforms stand on their hills, faded but majestic, watching the world and its people change. They are silent, but their silence is filled with meaning. It seems as if every crack and line on the surface is part of a message yet to be deciphered. And while it remains hidden, Palmela remains one of those rare places where antiquity breathes so close, as if the distance between eras disappears. The mystery of the Ecbatana tunnels. Beneath ancient Ecbatana, a city steeped for centuries in legends of treasures and the secrets they held, lies a network of tunnels constructed with such precision and grandeur that researchers still debate the capabilities of the builders. The tunnels extend to considerable depths, sometimes forming multi-level intersections reminiscent of the structure of a gigantic hidden city. They resemble neither the typical underground passages, nor the shelters, nor the secret passages characteristic of many ancient settlements. The Ecbatana tunnels appear to be something far more massive and complex. The first thing that strikes one about these underground passages is the quality of their construction. The walls of many tunnels are lined with stone blocks so tightly fitted that it's impossible to insert even a thin object between them. The blocks are of varying shapes, but their joints form remarkably even lines, as if the craftsmen used sophisticated tools to straighten them. Some stones bear traces of processing, resembling slight indentations that could have served as anchor points during installation. But the strangest thing is that such traces are found in the most inaccessible areas, where work would have been extremely difficult. The height of the tunnel ceilings varies depending on their purpose. Some are narrow passages where a person can only walk while stooped, while others are vast vaults that lead into darkness and create the feeling of a hidden space intended for meetings or other activities involving many people. Researchers analyzing the shape of these vaults have noted that they are constructed according to a principle that evenly distributes the load, preventing collapse. This suggests that the builders had a keen understanding of the properties of stone and soil, although such knowledge was not officially recorded in their time. Particularly noteworthy is the system of lateral niches located along the walls of some galleries. These niches are uniform in size and perfectly shaped. According to one theory, they may have housed oil lamps to illuminate the way. However, no traces of soot were found on the stones, disproving this idea. Another possible theory suggests that the niches were used to store small objects associated with rituals. However, the lack of finds forces us to reconsider this assumption as well. Each niche remains empty, as if the ancient inhabitants deliberately removed everything that could explain their purpose. Researchers are also amazed by the tunnel's acoustics. In some places, sound is amplified, as if the walls were deliberately constructed to direct it to a specific point. In others, the sound fades so quickly that it seems absorbed into the space. These features could have been part of a complex signaling system or served as an element of rituals performed underground. Ancient cultures often used underground spaces to connect with the world of their ancestors, and Ecbatana may have continued this tradition, creating conditions for experiences unavailable above ground. Despite the vastness of the network, almost no traces of everyday life have been found in the tunnels. No remains of pottery, fires, or tools. This indicates that the tunnels were not used as shelters or dwellings. Furthermore, there are no signs of mass human movement, making their function even more mysterious. Some believe the underground network was intended for the movement of priests or members of the nobility who could travel between parts of the city undetected. However, this theory fails to explain the enormous halls and the complexity of the entire structure. Legend has it that the tunnels of Ecbatana were built to protect the vast wealth hidden in the heart of the city. According to legend, kings hid their treasures in underground chambers reached by a labyrinthine maze of corridors. But archaeologists have found no evidence of such treasures. Moreover, the tunnel structure itself is too complex for a simple security system. If the purpose were simply to hide valuables, a few hidden chambers would have sufficed, not a multi-level network resembling an entire underground civilization. Some researchers suggest that the tunnels were connected to a water supply system. Underground canals in ancient cities often served to drain rainwater or store supplies. However, at Ecbatana, there are no traces of moisture or stone structures that could have retained water. Furthermore, the tunnels themselves are too straight and dry, and their vaults are too high to have been part of a water system. This makes the water hypothesis unlikely, although it cannot be completely ruled out. Interestingly, many tunnels coincide with the locations of ancient temples above ground. This suggests that underground routes may have connected sacred sites in the city, creating a hidden network that replicated the structure of sacred roads above ground. In this case, the tunnels could have served as venues for secret rituals accessible only to initiates. The passage from one temple to another through the darkness of the underground chambers could have symbolized the soul's journey between worlds. This also explains the unique acoustics. Rituals performed in such conditions would have intensified their emotional impact. No less mysterious is the question of how the builders navigated the underground. The tunnels intersect in such a way that a miscalculation could have led to the collapse of the vaults. But no such errors have been found. Each gallery is precisely designed as if the builders possessed a knowledge of geology and construction superior to that of known technology. This raises the possibility of ancient traditions passed down orally and not preserved in written sources. Despite extensive research, the tunnels of Ecbatana continue to fascinate with their mystery. It seems that every new meter explored creates more questions than answers. They don't resemble defensive structures, aren't an engineering system, don't serve as storage facilities, and leave no clear traces of rituals. Yet they exist, and with obvious intent. Ecbatana seemed to conceal another world beneath itself, one that only those who knew the way could enter. And today, when explorers descend into these dark passages, they sense the same silence the ancient priests heard. A silence filled with anticipation. Perhaps the tunnels were the creation of those who wanted to conceal not treasures, but knowledge. And if so, their mystery lies not in the question of purpose, but in the question of what truths were so important that they could only be conveyed in stone and darkness. The Lost Archives of Byblos. The city of Byblos, located on the coast of an ancient sea and once a key center of trade and knowledge, has always been surrounded by legends of great scrolls, preserving the memory of the peoples of the eastern Mediterranean. These legendary archives are mentioned in later texts, which speak of rooms filled with documents, tablets, ritual records, and rulers' records. But no one has ever seen the archives themselves. Only a shadow remains of them. Tiny references, seemingly scattered across different eras, as if someone were deliberately trying to erase the memory of what they contained. When archaeologists first began excavations in the area of ancient Byblos, they hoped to find traces of the vast writing tradition spoken of in legend. In ancient times, the city was an important hub connecting traders, priests, and rulers from various lands. Seafarers' routes constantly crossed here, and the exchange of knowledge was as important as the exchange of goods. It was assumed that such a place would have housed repositories where events, laws, and legends were recorded. However, no archives were discovered in the initial stages of the search. Nevertheless, in some excavated rooms, archaeologists found traces indicating the existence of a written tradition, charred pieces of thin bark and fragments of clay seals. This suggested that the archives may have existed, but disappeared for an unknown reason. Ancient fires in the city could have destroyed the fragile materials. But oddly, none of the surviving rooms appeared to be specially designed storage rooms. Even where seal remains were found, the walls bore no signs of shelves or niches typical of ancient libraries. Yet written accounts of Byblos indicate that the city was known for its school of priests, who recorded rituals and incantations on special tablets. These tablets, according to legend, were passed down from generation to generation. One ancient author claimed that Byblos contained knowledge about lands whose peoples had long since disappeared. However, if such records ever existed, they are now hidden or destroyed. Some researchers speculate that the archives may have been stored in separate underground chambers that have not yet been discovered. The city is located on a hill, which may conceal entire levels of ancient structures. Particularly intriguing is the story of priests who, according to ancestors, knew how to create secret storage rooms protected from destruction. These rooms could have been located beneath temples, where unauthorized access was prohibited. However, even carefully examined temples have revealed no traces of such chambers. The hypothesis remains that entrances to underground archives may have been located in places destroyed or filled in over the centuries. In some places, archaeologists have observed underground voids, but exploring them is difficult due to the risk of collapse. Another aspect frequently encountered in Byblos legends is the mention of a Book of Times, supposedly kept in the city. According to legend, it recorded the cycles of eras and natural phenomena. Some believe this book may have been part of the archives. While such stories are often perceived as symbolic, they indicate that the inhabitants of Byblos connected themselves to processes that extended far beyond the ordinary life of the city. Perhaps the archives truly contained more than mere economic records or ritualistic notes. Equally puzzling is the fact that references to biblical texts are found in various Mediterranean cultures. This indicates the archive's widespread influence, but doesn't explain why not a single fragment has survived. Researchers discuss the possibility that the archives were removed from the city during one of its many conquests. Such cases are not uncommon in history. Victors carried off important documents as symbols of power. But where could such vast collections have disappeared to? No collections matching the scale of the descriptions have been found in any of the known centers of the region. Of particular interest is a stone slab found near the temple, engraved with an image of a man holding a scroll. This could have been a symbol of priestly authority, but it also bears witness to the tradition of working with texts. Small indentations are located around the figure on the slab, possibly indicating the number of sections or levels of the repository. However, this design is open to various interpretations, and researchers are hesitant to draw firm conclusions. Some have advanced the bold hypothesis that the archives may not have been located in a single location, but rather constituted a network of smaller repositories. Each such repository could have contained a portion of the information: ritual texts, trade records, ancient legends. In this case, discovering them all would be virtually impossible, as time could have destroyed some, while others could have been hidden under new layers of construction. Furthermore, the ancient inhabitants of Byblos may have deliberately hidden some of the texts, considering them sacred or dangerous to the uninitiated. Particularly noteworthy is the theory that the archives were written on materials that do not withstand time. If the texts were written on bark or thin fabrics, they could have disappeared completely. However, why wouldn't the priests of such an important city have written their texts on more durable materials? This suggests that the archives served not only a practical, but also a ritual purpose, and the recording material may have had sacred significance, for example, being considered living or symbolically connected to nature. Despite the disappointment of the search, the very idea of lost archives makes Byblos one of the most enigmatic cities of antiquity. It seems to hold a secret that no one should know. If the archives were destroyed, it could have been done intentionally to conceal knowledge that could change our understanding of history. If they are hidden, perhaps they await someone who can decipher the signs left behind unintentionally. Thus, the legend of the lost archives lives on, as if the city itself whispers that the truth exists, but is hidden deeper than we can imagine. The stone walls of Carhenge. On the desolate hills of Carhenge, where the wind sweeps unimpeded across the dry land and leaves sinuous traces on the slopes, stand stone walls whose antiquity is palpable even without precise measurements. Their extent is astonishing, sometimes rising to the crests of the hills, sometimes disappearing into hollows, as if following a design understood only by their creators. They are constructed from massive stone blocks, worked with astonishing precision. Each block fits so tightly against the next that it seems as if the stones were once soft and then hardened into a perfect alignment. The builder's ability to achieve such precision remains a mystery, raising new questions with each study. The walls form a complex network, sprawling for many kilometers. Moreover, they do not form closed structures, as one might expect of defensive fortifications. Instead, the walls seem to wander across the landscape, sometimes bifurcating, sometimes converging at narrow points. This structural behavior is reminiscent of ancient sacred lines connecting points of power. However, not a single sanctuary or significant object has been found near the walls. This makes their purpose particularly unclear. Some researchers believe the walls served as territorial boundaries, others that they were symbols of power, but all these assumptions are dashed by the incredible labor invested in their construction. The stones used to construct the walls were taken from various locations. Geologists have discovered that some of the blocks are from nearby cliffs, but a significant portion originated from distant hills. This suggests that the ancient inhabitants of Carhenge transported heavy boulders over considerable distances without leaving traces of roads or any other means of transport. In some areas, the walls stand on steep slopes, making it extremely difficult to lift such massive stones. This suggests the existence of technological techniques not preserved by neighboring peoples. The builders may have used wooden structures, but no trace of them remains. The joints between the stones are particularly noteworthy. In some areas, the blocks are fitted together in a way that creates the impression of a jigsaw puzzle. The stones seem to fit together, creating a stable structure capable of withstanding strong earth movements. Researchers note that such joints are similar to a technique in which stone elements are cut into one another, preventing the walls from separating. However, most such techniques date back to later periods and are found in other regions. The appearance of this method at Carhenge evokes a compelling desire to understand the depth of the local craftsman's knowledge. Interestingly, the walls vary in height. In some places, they reach human height, while in others, they barely rise above the ground. This contradicts the idea of defensive purposes. Protection here is clearly insufficient. Moreover, the walls often lack internal logic. They can suddenly break off or abruptly change direction. Such variability seems odd for a structure designed for a specific practical function. Some researchers have suggested that the walls were part of a terracing program designed to retain soil. However, upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that the walls are too far apart and lack either a reinforced foundation or the sloping surfaces characteristic of terraces. Another theory suggests that the walls of Carhenge served as symbolic landmarks. Some sections do indeed align with the directions of sunrise during certain periods of the year. But such coincidences, while curious, are too rare to draw a firm conclusion. If the walls were part of an astronomical system, it would appear much more coherent. However, their chaotic nature precludes such an interpretation. However, it's possible that the meaning of the orientation was lost due to destruction or the absence of objects that could have complemented the depiction of the sky on Earth. Sometimes, barely noticeable lines appear on the surface of the stones. They don't resemble inscriptions or images, but rather resemble the marks left by tools used to shape the surface. However, some lines are oddly oriented, as if they were applied after the blocks were installed. This suggests a secondary use of the walls. Perhaps later inhabitants left their marks on the ancient structures, attempting to make sense of them. However, the lines are too thin and located in hard-to-reach places, making this theory dubious. A section of the wall that runs through the gorge poses a particular mystery. The stones there form a semicircular shape, reminiscent of an amphitheater. An unusual acoustic feature has been discovered at the center of this shape. A whisper in the center is significantly more audible than a loud voice nearby. This phenomenon has been studied by experts, and most believe it to be coincidental. However, too many coincidences indicate that the builders may have taken the sound of the space into account. This section of the wall may have been used for rituals involving sound. Although there is no direct evidence, the sense of the presence of an ancient tradition in these places haunts researchers. Despite the scale of the structures, no significant settlements have yet been discovered around the walls. Small camps existed, but they clearly couldn't support such a massive undertaking. This suggests that the builders came from outside or formed large communities only for the duration of the construction. This practice is well known among ancient peoples when the construction of sacred structures became a gathering point for the people. But why, after their completion, were the walls so isolated and devoid of traces of permanent habitation? Some believe the walls of Carhenge served as markers for an ancient route. Perhaps they pointed the way across the vast expanse, helping travelers navigate the plains. But this too raises questions. The walls are too complex to serve as simple landmarks, and their unevenness makes them less than useful. However, if the walls were part of a sacred road, the logic changes. Sacred paths rarely follow a straight line. They reflect myths, cycles, and travel patterns familiar to initiates, but hidden to the rest. Today, the walls of Carhenge stand amidst the winds, like the remnants of a world no longer belonging to time. They seem to sense the gaze of everyone who approaches them and respond only with silence. Their mystery lies not in their form, size, or technique, but in their continued existence as part of lost knowledge. Perhaps they were part of a vast structure that we see only fragments of. Perhaps they were symbols that have lost their context. Or perhaps the walls themselves are a message we have not yet learned to decipher. The unsolved bas-reliefs of Mitla. In the stone halls of ancient Mitla, where the air seems filled with the silence of centuries, lie mysterious bas-reliefs, striking in the precision of their lines and the intricacy of their hidden patterns. Their surfaces are covered with intertwining geometric motifs that defy simple interpretation. Each element of these patterns seems to be connected to the others, forming a unified language whose meaning eludes modern researchers. The bas-reliefs adorn the walls of halls, passages, and small shrines, creating the impression that the very walls of Mitla can speak. The first thing that strikes you about these bas-reliefs is their unusual execution technique. They create a sense of incredible depth, although they are actually carved into the stone surface by only a few millimeters. The artisans who created them masterfully created the illusion of volume using the subtlest interplay of light and shadow. The lines are so precise, as if they were drawn with a tool capable of maintaining a uniform depth throughout the entire design. However, analysis reveals that the ancient artisans used simple stone and bone tools. This makes the patterns even more mysterious, as if they were created using a technique that has been lost or hidden from later generations. What's particularly intriguing is that each hall at Mitla has its own distinct pattern. In one hall, the lines form complex triangular patterns, in another, repeating waves, and in a third, motifs reminiscent of intertwined roads. This diversity suggests that the bas-reliefs were part of a larger system of symbols, possibly conveying knowledge about the world, time, or the cycles of nature. Some researchers believe the patterns represented a map, but a map of an unknown type, not representative of the lands around Mitla. If it were indeed a map, it could have reflected a concept of spiritual or cosmic order, rather than physical landscapes. No less mysterious is the absence of images of people or gods characteristic of many cultures in the region. Mitla features no scenes of battles, hunting, or rituals. Instead, it features complex geometric systems devoid of direct narrative. This leads researchers to believe that Mitla's symbols were not intended for the general public, but were part of a closed tradition accessible only to a small circle of initiates. Perhaps the priests used these walls as a kind of book where every line and every angle had a meaning known only to those who could read this language. However, if it was a language, it was completely different from the known writing systems of the region. No comparisons with other texts have yielded any results. The bas-reliefs are too abstract, their lines too complex, to clearly determine their purpose. Some scholars have attempted to correlate the patterns with the movements of celestial bodies, believing that geometric shapes could reflect astronomical phenomena. But no calculations have yielded an exact match. Most likely, the bas-reliefs are indeed linked to cyclical processes, but these cycles are ritualistic or philosophical in nature, not physical. The central hall is particularly striking, with a seamless pattern stretching from floor to ceiling. It seems as if the artisans carved it in a single movement, creating a continuous line flowing from one plane to the next. Some researchers note unusual acoustics in the center of the hall. Whispers are amplified, while loud voices, conversely, disintegrate into distinct sounds. This creates the impression that the hall was intended for rituals involving sound. Perhaps the bas-relief served not only as a visual, but also as an acoustic element, directing sound along specific trajectories. There are sections of the walls where the patterns appear unfinished. The lines end abruptly, as if the artist was interrupted or deliberately left the work in this state. But upon closer inspection, it turns out that this incompleteness is merely an illusion. The patterns conceal transitions that become visible only under certain light angles. This suggests that the designs were designed not only for the human eye, but also for the movement of light throughout the day. Perhaps at certain times of the year, the bas-reliefs appear differently, revealing a second or even third layer of meaning. Some researchers suggest that the Mitla bas-reliefs may have been connected to rituals of transition between worlds. In ancient traditions, geometric patterns were often used to symbolize the paths along which souls traveled. Mitla may have been not only a place of life, but also a place of travel. Therefore, the bas-reliefs could be seen as maps of invisible paths used by priests during rituals. This explains their austerity, the absence of figures, and their incredible precision. Another hypothesis is that the patterns were part of a complex memory system. In the traditions of some peoples, important knowledge was transmitted through combinations of symbols and lines, which served as reminders for initiates. Such a system may have existed in Mitla, but its contents were lost along with the bearers of the tradition. Perhaps the bas-reliefs were a way to preserve knowledge not as text, but as structured images, understandable only to those trained in interpretation. Particularly interesting is the fact that engineers who studied the walls noted that the bas-reliefs strengthen the building's structures. The patterns are not simply decorative, they distribute the load, reducing the likelihood of wall collapse. This indicates that Mitla's masters understood how form can influence strength and combined art with engineering. However, this understanding fails to explain the rich symbolism of the patterns, which clearly goes beyond pure technical necessity. The real challenge remains. Why did such a grandiose system of symbols disappear from subsequent cultures in the region? If the bas-reliefs were part of an important tradition, it should have left its mark. But no continuations of this style have been found. It seems as if the knowledge underlying the designs was either lost or deliberately concealed. Perhaps it belonged to a small group of priests who did not pass it on to their heirs. Or this knowledge was intended for a specific time, after which it lost its significance. Today, the Mitla bas-reliefs stand before researchers like a silent book, written in a language no one understands. Their lines continue to raise questions, their geometry, hypotheses, and their silence, a strange feeling, as if someone has left us a message we are not yet ready to understand. And perhaps this is precisely their true power. They remind us that not all knowledge can be deciphered, and that the ancient world held depths far beyond our expectations. The disappearance of the Tassili culture. In the heart of the stony Tassili Desert, where time seems frozen and the wind has carved the rocks into bizarre shapes for hundreds of centuries, there once lived a people known today only by traces left on the stone walls. These traces are astonishing drawings depicting scenes that cannot be associated with the everyday life of desert tribes. Here, amidst the hot stone and eternal silence, the legacy of a culture that vanished so mysteriously that its disappearance has become one of the most intriguing mysteries of antiquity. Tassili's most famous legacy is its multitude of rock carvings, preserved thanks to the dry climate and its remoteness from major settlements. These images depict people, animals, strange figures with rounded heads reminiscent of masks, and even scenes that are difficult to interpret, creatures seemingly floating in space, people next to strange objects whose forms are not found among local artifacts. Many researchers believe these scenes may have been symbolic, reflecting myths or rituals. But others believe the Tassili artists were depicting something that actually happened before their eyes. Particularly noteworthy are the depictions of large animals, which haven't been seen in the desert for many thousands of years. Perhaps the climate of Tassili was different in past eras, allowing for a rich fauna. However, it's not the presence of animals that is surprising, but the precision with which the artists conveyed their proportions and movements. This suggests that the Tassili culture possessed a highly developed skill of observation and a visual tradition that spanned generations. However, traces of settlements consistent with such a rich artistic school have been found, raising questions about where these people lived and why their traces have disappeared so completely. Some scholars suggest that the Tassili culture may have disappeared due to climate change. The desert gradually expanded, depriving the inhabitants of water and pasture. But this scenario seems too simplistic for such an advanced people. If Tassili truly was a vast cultural center, it should have had ways of adapting to climate change, relocation, the creation of water collecting systems, or the adoption of a new way of life. However, no traces of such adaptations have been found. The culture's disappearance occurred too quickly, leaving a sense of abruptness. The mystery is heightened by the fact that some of the wall images suggest unusual rituals. Some depict groups of people standing in a circle as if performing an important ritual. Others depict figures resembling priests, holding objects resembling vessels or symbols of power. But what's most striking is the depiction of people wearing strange headdresses that resemble closed helmets. Such forms are not found in any other culture in the region. These may be ritual masks, but their recurrence raises questions. The interpretation of images depicting figures seemingly connected by lines or surrounded by halos also generates considerable controversy. Some researchers believe these are symbols of spiritual connections. Others suggest they depict altered states of consciousness occurring during rituals involving plants. Another theory is that Tassili artists depicted visions occurring during ceremonies. Their culture may have been linked to strong spiritual traditions, and the disappearance of the people may be linked to changes in their beliefs or social structures. However, this theory does not explain the complete loss of their material heritage. The lack of large burial sites also remains a mystery. Many ancient peoples had burial complexes that connected people with their ancestors. But the Tassili culture left no significant burial grounds. This leads to the hypothesis that their burial customs utilized materials that do not last, such as wood or fabric. Perhaps the bodies were left in places where they would quickly deteriorate under the influence of nature. However, there is a more symbolic explanation. The people may have believed that the body would return to the natural cycle without human intervention, leaving behind only the spiritual essence. Some researchers believe the disappearance of the Tassili culture is linked to migration. The people may have migrated, abandoning their lands in pursuit of better living conditions. But migrations usually leave traces, settlements along the route, evidence of adaptation to new conditions, and borrowings from other cultures. Here, however, such traces are absent. This creates the impression that the people did not disappear gradually, but rather vanished into thin air. Even if they did leave, they did so in such a way as to leave no evidence of their journey. There's a hypothesis that the Tassili culture may not have been a distinct people, but a collection of different groups united by common rituals. In this case, their disappearance could have been gradual. The groups disintegrated, returned to their tribes, and the unified tradition disappeared. But then why was their shared artistic style so coherent and developed? Such art is impossible to create without a long tradition and specialized artisans. Geography plays a special role in the investigation. Many of the drawings are located in difficult-to-reach places, on high ledges, in deep gorges, under overhanging cliffs. It seems these locations were chosen deliberately. Perhaps they were considered sacred or used for rituals requiring solitude. But why are ritual centers located in such remote and difficult locations? This creates the impression that the Tassili culture sought to separate itself from the world, creating a space of spiritual concentration. But such isolation makes the disappearance even more puzzling. Some images at Tassili are so unusual that they have given rise to theories linking the culture to phenomena that ancient people could not have possessed. However, such theories are not considered within a scientific approach. However, the fact remains. The artists depicted something that still amazes today. Perhaps they witnessed nature at moments when it manifested itself in unusual ways. Perhaps the visions that arose in altered states were so vivid that the artists sought to capture them on stone. The disappearance of the Tassili culture is not simply the disappearance of a people. It is the disappearance of a world capable of creating complex images, profound symbols, and enigmatic scenes. Today, we see only their shadows on the rocks. The Tassili culture vanished without leaving behind storytellers, but its images live on, as if waiting for someone to hear their silent story. Granite blocks of Tunisia. In the rocky lands of Tanisos, where a harsh wind blows dust across the hills and creates the illusion of a perpetual rustling, lie granite blocks whose origin has remained a mystery for decades. These massive boulders appear to have been scattered by a giant's hand, though closer inspection reveals their arrangement to be too precise to be random. Some blocks lie flat, others stand upright, and still others form linear groups, as if they once served as the foundation of a vanished structure. However, no traces of walls or buildings have been found nearby, making the presence of the blocks even more puzzling. The granite from which these blocks are made differs from the rocks common in the area around Tanisa. Geologists claim that the nearest deposits of this type of rock are located a considerable distance away. This means that the ancient inhabitants must have transported heavy stone blocks across rugged terrain. But how they did this remains unknown. No traces of roads, tracks, or special equipment have been found. Moreover, the blocks are arranged in such a way that it seems as if they were placed not simply with effort, but with calculation. Such careful placement requires not only strength, but also a precise understanding of the weight, balance, and structure of the stone. Some blocks are so enormous that their weight is estimated at tens of tons, yet their surfaces show signs of workmanship. The lines are perfectly straight, and the edges are surprisingly straight for ancient tools. Researchers note that some blocks have fine grooves that could have been made by a Burin-like tool. However, such a tool would have to be incredibly durable for granite, and the use of stone or bronze tools would have left entirely different marks. This suggests the existence of a stoneworking technology that has not been preserved in the region's history. The way the individual blocks are arranged is particularly striking. In several places, the granite boulders rest on a narrow support point, as if balancing on a small ledge. This position is extremely unstable and requires exceptional precision during installation. Given the strong winds typical of Tanisa, the blocks would have long since fallen if they had not been positioned with a perfectly calculated weight distribution. Modern engineers note that such stability is only possible with precise measurements, raising doubts that the ancient craftsmen acted at random. However, archaeologists have found no measuring instruments associated with these structures. Small holes, spaced at regular angles, were found in some of the blocks. These holes are too narrow to have served as places for wooden wedges or carrying devices. They appear to be guide points that could have been used during the installation of the blocks. But who made them and why? And why are the holes found only on some stones and not all? These questions remain unanswered, and attempts to interpret the holes as elements of ritualistic actions have not yet been supported by other finds. There's a theory that Tanisa was home to an ancient stoneworking center where craftsmen created blocks for subsequent transport to other regions. This theory partially explains the large number of processed blocks. But then where did the structures themselves disappear to, the very reason these blocks were created? No cultural complex corresponding to the scale of production has been found in the surrounding area. Moreover, the blocks are too large and too precisely crafted to be prefabricated blocks for further processing. They appear complete, like the finished part of a well-thought-out structure. Some researchers believe the blocks may have been part of an unfinished megalithic complex. If the builders abandoned the site for an unknown reason, they could have left the prepared parts on the ground. But that raises the question, why were such large and heavy elements left in perfect order? Abandoned construction sites typically appear chaotic, whereas the Tanisa blocks lie as if they were arranged according to an invisible plan. Perhaps this plan was only partially realized, and the rest of the complex was never begun. Another mystery concerns the orientation of the blocks. Some groups are oriented to the cardinal directions with astonishing precision. This suggests that the stones may have been part of an astronomical system or ritual complex based on celestial observation. However, there are no traces of the cult structures typically associated with such systems at Tanisa. Moreover, the blocks do not form closed figures or circles, characteristic of known astronomical complexes. Their arrangement remains too arbitrary for such an interpretation. Interestingly, small stone objects, clearly created by the same artisans, are also found in the area around Tanisa. These objects, fragments of small statues, broken vessels, or stone slabs, are crafted in a similar style. This suggests that an artistic tradition existed in the region, but the connection between these small objects and the giant blocks remains unclear. Perhaps these are two parts of the same culture, separated by function. Some artisans created small objects, others enormous megaliths. Some researchers note a strange harmony in the landscape of Tanissos. The blocks are arranged as if they were shaped by the hills, the wind, and even the sun's movement. This creates the impression that Tanissos was a place where the interaction between man and nature was particularly significant. But if this is true, why did the culture that created such monumental forms vanish without leaving behind any history, names, or legends? There are no answers yet. The granite blocks of Tanissos stand on the dry ground like forgotten stone guardians. They seem simultaneously alien and familiar to this place, as if they once belonged to another era or another people, a people history has forgotten. Their rough surfaces, perfect edges, and mysterious landmarks continue to raise questions. And it seems as if each block holds a distinct story, one that cannot be told in words. But the feeling remains that Tanis is not silent. His blocks seem to be waiting for us to learn to read their language, the language of stone, silence, and precision. Perhaps their purpose will never be fully revealed. But it is precisely in this ambiguity that their power lies. They remind us that the past does not always reveal itself to those who seek answers, but sometimes to those who can see beyond the surface. Stone courtyards of La Izada, high among the jagged cliffs of La Izada, where the sun rises slowly and solemnly over the stone ridges, lie hidden courtyards carved by the hands of ancient craftsmen. Paved with heavy slabs of unknown origin, these courtyards appear like fragments of a forgotten city, but no residential structures have been found around them. They lie unusually evenly, as if they were created at the same time, although natural traces indicate that the stones have survived many eras. The courtyards are located at different levels on the mountain slopes, and each has its own geometry, as if intended for different activities or gatherings. However, their true purpose remains unclear, creating the feeling that La Izada conceals a history that was part of the world, but disappeared along with its bearers. The first thing that catches the researchers' attention is the unusual structure of the stone slabs. They are made of a hard rock rarely found in these mountains. Geologists claim that deposits of this rock are located at a considerable distance, meaning the slabs were brought here intentionally. However, transporting such massive masses up steep slopes is extremely difficult, even with modern technology. Upon inspection, it is clear that the slabs are fitted together so precisely that there are almost no visible gaps between them. This creates the impression that the stones were inserted into prepared recesses or processed directly on site, but no evidence of intermediate work has been found. Each courtyard has distinctive features, a flat surface, distinct angles, and unique acoustics. The sound emanating from within the courtyard changes depending on where you stand. In some places it is amplified, while in others it becomes muffled, as if the space were designed to direct sound along specific paths. This suggests that the courtyards may have been used for gatherings or rituals where the sound of the human voice played an important role. Perhaps the speech of a priest or chieftain was intended to sound solemn, passing through stone resonators. However, no images or symbols indicating ritual actions have yet been found. An interesting feature of La Izada is that the courtyards do not form a unified system. They are located independently of one another, with no traces of roads or paths between them that would indicate a unified complex. Some researchers suggest that the courtyards may have been used seasonally or sporadically when groups of people came to the mountains for specific activities. However, this raises new questions. Why were such complex structures built for sporadic use? And who were these people if no traces of permanent habitation have been found at La Isara itself? Another mystery is the steps leading to some courtyards. These steps are carved directly into the stone, are of uniform height and width, but do not lead to a building or level platform. They end right at the edge of the courtyard, creating a theatrical effect, as if one were to emerge from above, stepping onto a flat stone surface. This theatrical impression, combined with acoustic features, suggests that the courtyards may have been a restoration of an ancient tradition of oral performances, perhaps related to mythological spectacles or storytelling rituals. Some slabs show signs of fine workmanship. Barely noticeable lines appear on their surfaces, forming almost geometric patterns. These lines are too fine to be random cracks. However, their arrangement does not form maps or symbols. They resemble marks left by a tool when smoothing the surface. However, the repetition of the lines on different slabs suggests that they may have been part of a ritual system associated with the direction of light or shadow. Perhaps at certain times of the year, these lines merged into a larger pattern, visible only under specific lighting conditions. However, no researcher has yet been able to document such a phenomenon. Among the courtyards, there is one that stands out from the others. It is shaped like an irregular oval and surrounded by a low stone wall, barely rising above the ground. The courtyard creates a strange sense of enclosure, despite the absence of a gate or passage. Its walls slope slightly inward, creating a concentrated sound effect. In the center of the courtyard is a smooth, rounded stone, resembling a natural boulder, but placed too evenly to be random. Some believe this stone may have been a sacrificial altar or a symbol of the courtyard's spiritual center. However, no bones, ashes, or ritual objects were found in the area. Another theory is that the stone courtyards may have served as astronomical stations. The height of the slopes and the open sky create ideal conditions for stargazing. Perhaps the masters of La Isara built the courtyards as reference points from which to observe certain constellations at key times of the year. But that raises the question, why are the courtyards so randomly arranged? If they were astronomical stations, their placement should have followed a strict pattern. But the geometry of La Isara is too loose for such a purpose, although certain horizon lines are still observed. Some researchers point to traces of ancient erosion. The stones in some courtyards appear to have been exposed to strong water. This suggests that La Isara once had streams that no longer exist. In this case, the courtyards could have been created during a different climate. But if the climate changed gradually, why did people abandon these places so suddenly, leaving the courtyards perfect and undamaged? Perhaps their departure was linked not to nature, but to a cultural or spiritual event. Interestingly, local legends mention people who came to these mountains only to perform special ceremonies. They didn't live here permanently and didn't bring their belongings with them. They came, performed their rituals, and departed, leaving behind only quiet stone courtyards. These legends could be distorted recollections of actual events. If so, then La Isara truly was a ritual space, intended for temporary gatherings of the chosen few. But what exactly took place here remains a mystery. Some architects who have studied the courtyards note that the slabs are incredibly well balanced. They lie as if they were laid in the absence of gravity. Several slabs exhibit small protrusions that could have served as anchors or support points for lifting structures. However, no wooden remains have been found. This suggests that the ancients used methods that did not require wooden mechanisms, perhaps levers, stone wedges, or counterweight systems. However, there is no definitive data, and everything remains speculative. Today, the stone courtyards of La Isara continue to preserve their silence. They seem carved from the very fabric of time. When one stands in the middle of a courtyard and hears the strange echo of one's voice, one feels as if the space remembers every step of those who came here thousands of years ago. The courtyards offer no answers. They convey only the presence of an ancient world that once lived here and vanished as silently as the wind blowing along the stone paths. Perhaps La Isada will one day reveal its secret, or perhaps its courtyards were created precisely to remain incomplete. And then their silence is not an absence of sound, but a story that can only be heard with the heart. Cave chambers of Ambat. Deep in the rocky massifs of Ambat, where gorges descend into the earth like mountain roots and light penetrates only in narrow beams, cave chambers are hidden, striking in their combination of natural forms and the obvious handiwork of human hands. These chambers form a network of spaces connected by passages, yet they do not resemble ordinary caves. Their contours reveal a geometry too precise to be created by nature alone. Each chamber has its own character, as if designed for a specific purpose, and together they create the impression of a complex underground complex whose purpose remains unclear. The first thing the researchers notice is the unusual shape of some of the chambers. Instead of the chaotic curves typical of natural cavities, they feature nearly symmetrical ovals, straight walls, smooth transitions, and vertical planes, as if smoothed by a tool. However, the Ambat rock is too hard to be worked with simple stone tools. On some walls, traces resembling thin stripes are visible, as if made by a steadily moving tool. These stripes run parallel to each other and appear as if someone smoothed the stone layer by layer. However, not a single suitable tool was found among the finds. The arrangement of the chambers is no less surprising. They do not form a simple chain or ring, but are connected by passages located at different levels. Some passages are too narrow for comfortable movement of people, as if they were intended not for everyday use, but for special events. In other places, the passages are so wide that they create the impression of meeting halls. However, no traces of permanent occupation, hearths, pottery, or tools were found. The chambers seem to eschew everyday use and belong to the realm of the sacred. At the center of the Ambat complex is the largest chamber, which has attracted the attention of researchers for many years. It is shaped like a nearly perfect dome, and its floor is so smooth it appears polished. In the center of the chamber is a rounded stone, standing on a thin base, seemingly floating in midair. Geologists believe this is a natural formation, but its placement is too precise. The stone stands precisely in the center, and concentric lines extending in different directions are visible around it. These lines are barely noticeable and could have been traces of surface smoothing or part of a ritual design. The acoustic properties of the chambers were particularly useful for the research. In some of them, sound is amplified so strongly that a light whisper turns into a deep, resonant tone that reverberates through the stone. This phenomenon is reminiscent of natural resonators, but here it appears to be highly directional. As soon as one moves a step to the side, the effect disappears. This may indicate that the chambers were designed with acoustics in mind. Perhaps the ancient inhabitants of Ambat used sound in their rituals. It's no coincidence that in some cultures, sound was considered a bridge between worlds. Perhaps it played an important role here, too. Another mystery is the presence of smooth vertical holes extending into the floor or ceiling. These holes are nearly uniform in diameter and have perfectly smooth walls. Their purpose remains controversial. Some believe they served as ventilation, but their placement is unusual. The holes often lead not to the surface, but to voids located above or below. Perhaps they had symbolic significance or were used in rituals related to air movement. Another theory is that light passed through them at certain times of the year, creating a play of sun and shadow within the chambers that could have had ritual significance. Interestingly, there are no images or inscriptions on the walls of the chambers. Unlike many ancient complexes, Ambat eschews symbolism, leaving only the spatial structure. This creates the feeling that shapes and sounds themselves were the complex's primary language. Perhaps the rituals performed here required no images. But such minimalism is unusual and raises questions about the worldview of the people who created Ambat. Some researchers have noted traces of erosion present on the lower parts of the walls. These traces are consistent with the effects of prolonged exposure to water. This has led to a bold hypothesis. Ambat may have been created or used during a significantly wetter climate. If these chambers did indeed contain standing water, they could have been part of a reservoir system. But in that case, why were they aligned with such precision, and how can we explain the acoustic effects, which would disappear when the chambers were filled with water? These questions undermine the water hypothesis, rendering it incomplete. Astronomical theories have also been put forward. Some passages are oriented in such a way that on certain days sunlight penetrates deep into the chambers, creating an unusual glow within. This may have been connected to calendar rituals important for agricultural or spiritual practices. However, precise coincidences with key points in the solar cycle are rare, and for now, this theory remains only a hypothesis. Another detail is the footprints resembling footsteps carved into the slopes leading to the chamber entrances. These footprints are arranged as if people were climbing the rock face directly to the entrances, and such footprints must have been used regularly. But if the complex was frequently used, why are there so few traces of occupation inside? Perhaps the Ambat complex was the site of special and rare rituals, accessible only to a select few. Then the lack of everyday objects is understandable. People came here only for rituals. An unusual phenomenon was discovered in one of the side halls. When a person stands at a certain point, their voice reverberates in a way that creates the impression of another person's presence. Acousticians studied this phenomenon and confirmed that it is related to the shape of the walls and the dome. Perhaps this place was known as a meeting point where people experienced the presence of ancestral spirits. In ancient cultures, such effects were often considered signs of the spirit world. Local legends suggest that Ambat was a place where people came to commune with the mountain spirits. These legends, of course, cannot be considered accurate descriptions of the past, but they may point to an ancient tradition associated with subterranean spaces. People may have believed that powers resided within the depths of the stone, capable of providing answers or blessings. Perhaps the cave complex was used to immerse oneself in unusual states of consciousness, where one felt a connection with nature and one's ancestors. The cave chambers of Ambat are a space created on the boundary between the natural and the human. They resemble neither a temple, nor a dwelling, nor a typical sanctuary. Rather, they resemble a place of transition, a boundary between worlds where people came to hear what could not be heard on the surface. Today, they continue to preserve their profound silence, and anyone standing in their center feels as if the stone is listening. Perhaps the secret of Ambat lies not in the walls themselves, but in what happened within, in those ancient voices and thoughts that have dissolved into stone and time. Terraces of the ancient Cadmiums. High in the Rocky Mountains, where the slopes rise in steep cliffs and seem inaccessible, are scattered terraces created by a people whose name is preserved only in legend, the ancient Cadmi. These terraces are stepped platforms, laid with stone so meticulously that some researchers doubt they could have been created with primitive tools alone. They cling to the mountains, rising one above the other like a giant staircase, leading to neither city nor temple. And yet, every facet of them exudes intent whose meaning has long since faded into time. The first mystery researchers encounter is the location of the terraces. They are located in an area with little soil and even less water. No agricultural people would have built such complex stone platforms in a place where growing crops is nearly impossible. This makes the hypothesis of an agricultural purpose for the terraces questionable. Moreover, the terrace surfaces themselves are too smooth, almost polished, to serve as planting sites. Some have suggested that the terraces were used to collect rainwater. However, they show no traces of canals, depressions, or channeling channels typical of water collection systems. Nevertheless, the terraces are positioned with astonishing precision. Their corners are aligned with the horizon, and some sections are oriented toward the sun's points at certain times of the year. This suggests that the terraces may have served an astronomical function. Perhaps they served as platforms for observing the sky. But then the question arises, why so many of them? If the purpose was observation, a few platforms would have sufficed. But the Cadmeans built dozens of terraces, each requiring a tremendous amount of labor. Another hypothesis relates to ritualistic activities. The terraces could have been paths along which participants in the ceremonies moved. The steps between the platforms are sometimes too high, making them inconvenient for ordinary movement. But if the activities were sacred in nature, the difficulty of the ascent could have been part of the ritual. In some cultures, the transition from one level to another symbolized the transition between worlds or states of mind. Perhaps the cadmium terraces served as a path of initiation. Interestingly, the terrace walls were constructed from stones of varying shapes. Some are rectangular, cut smoothly and precisely, while others retain their natural shape, but are set in such a way as to create the impression of a monolithic surface. This combination of the natural and the artificial seems to be part of the design, as if the craftsmen were striving to unite nature and human creativity. The stones are so tightly fitted together that even after many centuries, cracks between them are difficult to detect. Such precision speaks to a high level of mastery of stonemasonry. However, the terrace surfaces show no signs of tool working, no scratches or furrows, as if the stones had been smoothed by some unknown method. This suggests that the Cadme may have known a method of softening stone, similar to the legends of other peoples, where the stone became as pliable as clay. Of course, there is no practical evidence of this, but the terraces themselves create the impression that the stones from which they are constructed were worked with extraordinary ease and precision. Another oddity is the lack of the infrastructure typically associated with such architectural structures. There are no roads or permanent settlements nearby. It would seem that such grandiose walls should have been part of a larger complex. However, excavations have not uncovered even the remains of dwellings. This has led to the hypothesis that the Cadmes came here only periodically, perhaps at special times of the year. The terraces could then have served as temporary gathering centers or venues for festivals associated with the cyclical changes of nature. Among the terraces, there's one that stands out from the rest. It's shaped like an elongated ellipse, and its surface is slightly inclined. At certain sun angles, the shadow of the surrounding wall falls on its surface, creating an unusual image. Researchers have observed that in the middle of the spring cycle, the shadow takes on a shape resembling a human silhouette. This may have been part of a ritual symbolizing the appearance of an ancestor, hero, or deity. However, an exact match between shadow and figure is difficult to achieve, and this phenomenon could have been accidental. It is hypothesized that the terraces were not independent structures, but rather part of a sound transmission system. On some of them, sound propagates in a striking manner. If you speak in one corner of the terrace, your voice is heard on the other side, but not in the center. This suggests that the terraces may have been sites for speech or musical rituals where sound acted as a conductor. However, the terraces are located too far apart to form a unified acoustic system. Some elements of the terraces resemble areas where astronomical observations were conducted. Stones located on the platform's border are sometimes aligned with specific stars. Scientists are attempting to link these alignments to important celestial events. However, sufficient coincidences have not yet been found to establish a comprehensive astronomical system. It's possible that the Cadmes used only certain terraces for celestial observations, while the others served other functions. The most enigmatic thing about the terraces is their sense of unfinished work. Some platforms appear perfectly symmetrical and complete, while others seem only just begun. The walls end abruptly, the surface is uneven, and the stones are arranged as if the craftsman hadn't finished the job yet. But upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that these aren't signs of unfinished construction, but part of a design. They appear unfinished only by modern standards. Perhaps the Cadmes built the terraces gradually, following cycles, rather than striving for completion within a specific time frame. Some researchers suggest that the terraces may have served as a kind of map. When viewed from above, their arrangement creates a pattern resembling a geometric shape. This may have been a map of the area or a diagram associated with the Cadmean myths. However, the shape is too abstract to be tied to the terrain. Instead, it may be linked to ritual geography, a conception of the world in which each terrace occupied a symbolic place. Legends passed down to nearby peoples speak of the Cadmes as builders who could create stone forms effortlessly. They came to the mountains only on special days when the rocks opened their hearts. This is, of course, merely a poetic image, but it supports the idea that terraces were not part of everyday life. They are rare, difficult to access, and crafted with such meticulous care as if they were created not for people, but for the earth itself. Today, the Cadmean terraces stand like enormous stone pages inscribed with a language lost to the world. Their steps resemble the footprints of giants, their walls like the broken lines of a poem composed by nature and ancient masters. And although we do not know why they were created, one thing is clear. They were part of a world where man sought to communicate with the mountains, the sky, and time. Perhaps the terraces were a meeting place for people with great cycles, or perhaps a reflection of ancient knowledge, awaiting those who can hear it anew. Underground galleries of Agia Nicola. Deep beneath the hills of Agia Nicola lies a world created not by nature, but by the hands of those whose names have long since faded into the mists of time. These underground galleries, extending hundreds of meters into the earth, form a network of corridors, halls, and hidden chambers so ingenious that early explorers long believed their antiquity. But analysis of the rock and tool marks reveals that the galleries were indeed created many centuries ago, long before the emergence of known settlements in this area. Who built them and why? There are no answers, only traces, carving a riddle into the very stone. The Agia Nicola galleries differ from other underground structures in that their form is excessively symmetrical. Most of the passages are of uniform width and height, and their walls are crafted with such precision that in places they appear polished. This is surprising, given the hardness of the rock in which they are carved. The marks of the carving do not resemble the impacts of a stone tool. They are too smooth, as if the surface were smoothed not by blows, but by the movement of a wide, flat blade. But what kind of tool this might have been remains unknown. Some galleries have a unique shape, long corridors tapering toward one end. This geometry creates an interesting acoustic effect. A sound spoken in the narrow part is amplified, reverberating multiple times. This feature may have been used in rituals. Imagine an ancient priest pronouncing ritual words, and the walls amplify them, transforming them into a polyphonic sound that echoes back. It's quite possible that the galleries were built as spaces for spiritual practices, where the human voice acquired a different, almost mystical resonance. However, there are other passages that are completely devoid of resonance. There, sound fades, as if the space itself absorbs it. These areas seem particularly strange. Absorbent acoustics are only possible with a certain wall shape or the presence of microscopic cavities in the rock. But in the galleries of Agia Nicola, such effects seem intentional, as if the builders knew how to distribute the space so that sound would disappear. Perhaps these areas served as places of silence, where meditations or rituals requiring the complete absorption of sound were performed. One of the most puzzling finds in the galleries were vertical shafts extending upward and downward. Some of them end in small chambers, while others are empty openings. They are too narrow to serve as passages, but their placement is too deliberate to be random. It has been hypothesized that the shafts served for ventilation. But that raises the question, why would there be ventilation in a place with no evidence of permanent human presence? Perhaps the shafts were used as light channels. On certain days, sunlight does indeed reach some of the lower chambers. However, such coincidences are too rare for this to be the shaft's primary function. What makes the Agia Nicola galleries particularly mysterious is the absence of any objects that could be associated with their use. No bones, no pottery, no metal elements, no traces of fire. This suggests that the galleries were either carefully cleaned or used at a time and for activities that left no material traces. Perhaps the entire complex was a space for special rituals, where the primary role was played not by the material world, but by stone itself, sound, darkness, and light. Some researchers believe the galleries may have been part of a network of secret routes connecting different parts of the region. However, this theory faces a serious problem. The galleries do not lead to other settlements. They form a closed system, not connected to the surface by any large tunnels. This suggests they were built not for travel, but for sojourns within, perhaps short-lived, but filled with significant meaning. Interestingly, in some of the gallery's halls, recesses in the floor were discovered resembling the remains of vessels or stands. Their shape is perfectly round, as if created specifically to accommodate a specific object. But what exactly is unknown? Perhaps these recesses held stone bowls filled with water or oil. The water could have served as a mirror, reflecting lights or sunlight, creating a play of light within the chambers. Such phenomena are known in various ancient cultures. However, in Agia Nicola, there are no traces of soot, suggesting that fires were used extremely rarely or even entirely. It is believed that the galleries may have served as initiation sites. Narrow corridors, alternating with spacious halls, create the sensation of a journey through different states. In one place, a person might hear amplified sound, in another, silence. Light entered the halls only at certain moments, emphasizing symbolic transitions. Perhaps newly initiated people passed through the galleries to experience fear, awe, and the sense of the presence of another power. The absence of objects, then, is understandable. The rituals were based not on material objects, but on experiences. Local legends include stories of stone roads beneath the mountain, where the footsteps of those long gone can be heard. These stories, of course, are folkloric in nature, but they describe the gallery's acoustic effects with remarkable accuracy. Perhaps folk memory has preserved echoes of ancient rituals that involved sound, darkness, and movement. But who performed these rituals and in what era they existed is unknown. There's a bolder hypothesis. The galleries may have served as a place for observing the stars, underground. Some cultures believed in stargates, places where the human spirit could connect with the heavens. The vertical shafts of Agia Nicola may have symbolized these connections. When starlight penetrated the lower chamber, it could have been considered a sign. But this interpretation is too symbolic and lacks archaeological evidence. However, in the absence of other explanations, it finds its supporters. Despite all the exploration, the underground galleries of Agia Nicola continue to amaze with their perfection. They resemble architecture created not for habitation, but for perceiving the world differently. Every form, every turn, seems deliberate, every chamber imbued with a meaning we cannot yet comprehend. The galleries seem to await someone who can hear their language, the language of stone, silence, and light. Today, researchers walk these ancient corridors, listening to every echo, examining every line. And yet, the feeling remains unchanged, as if the galleries were created to remain unsolved. Perhaps their purpose should never be fully restored. Perhaps the mystery of Agia Nicola is itself part of their essence, preserved by ancient masters as a reminder that there are places in the world where a person should feel not knowledge, but awe. Stone cells of Kalpatra. High on the ledges of Kalpatra, where the morning mist drifts across the stone like the ancient smoke of the past, lie the stone cells, small chambers carved into the rock with such precision that their origins are still debated. These cells form a complex, connected by narrow paths that sometimes seem too smooth for natural formations. Entering here, you experience a strange sensation. The space seems simultaneously open and hidden, as if it holds knowledge not meant for everyone. The first thing that strikes researchers is the size of the cells. They are unusually small, barely large enough to stand and offer almost no room to move. This led to the initial theory that the cells served as places of solitude and meditation. But even for such practices, the space seems too small. Some cells have only a single small niche, reminiscent of a seated position. Others have ceilings that slope upward, creating the impression of a well through which light penetrates in the middle of the day. These rays entering the cell form an even column of light, illuminating only the center of the room. This design seems too deliberate to be accidental. Equally astonishing are the traces of workmanship on the walls. The stone at Kalpatra is hard and layered, making it difficult to work even with metal tools. But the surfaces of the cells are smooth, as if polished. In some areas, fine lines running parallel to each other are visible. They don't look like signs of chopping or chipping. Rather, they resemble traces of slow, even wear. Perhaps the craftsman used sand or an abrasive compound, but the volume of work is so vast that this explanation seems inadequate. This is especially true given the cell's location in hard-to-reach places, requiring enormous effort to transport materials and tools. A particularly puzzling feature is the system of holes located in the upper part of the cells. These holes are nearly identical in diameter and angled slightly upward. At first glance, it seems they served as ventilation. However, when analyzing the air movement, researchers notice that the holes create a pulling effect. Air enters the cell, flows along the walls, and exits through another channel. This distribution is necessary not for ventilation, but to maintain a certain humidity and temperature. This suggests that the cells were used for practices requiring control over breathing or air quality. Some cells are connected by narrow passages. These passages are not suitable for women or children, only for adults of average build. The passages are angled so that crawling through them is difficult, but possible. This has led to the hypothesis that passing through these narrow spaces was part of a purification ritual. In some traditions, such passages symbolize birth or transcendence. If so, the cells may have served as places of initiation, where a person would undergo a physical ordeal and then enter a space of silence. The deepest cell of Kalpatra has particularly attracted the attention of researchers. It is shaped like a vertical cylinder, descending almost to the height of a human. Traces resembling cut steps are visible on its walls, but they are too shallow to be used by feet. They may have served as handholds. If a person descended inside, they would sit in complete darkness, surrounded by stone on all sides. In such a place, the sense of space completely disappears. Some experts believe such isolation may have induced an altered state of consciousness, similar to deep meditation. However, not all cells are alike. Some are shaped like irregular ovals. Their acoustics are distinct. Sound inside behaves strangely, as if condensed and returning to the person in a modified form. The effect resembles an echolocation wave. A hypothesis has emerged that these cells may have served as places for sound-creating practices. In some traditions, sound was considered the key to understanding the world, and the use of such rooms may have been part of spiritual exercises. But why are the cells so high? Access requires climbing over cliffs, and even experienced explorers sometimes spend hours just reaching a small section. If the cells were used for spiritual practices, the difficulty of the climb could have been part of the ritual. However, the lack of evidence of permanent habitation in the surrounding area suggests that the site was rarely visited. No hearths, animal bones, or pottery have been found, nothing to indicate domestic activity. The cells seem designed solely for brief visits. In some parts of Kalpatra, traces of ancient paths leading to groups of cells have been discovered. These paths are too smooth and narrow to be shepherd's trails. The stone is worn down, as if the feet of many people had traversed the same route. But if so many people ascended here, why are there so few traces inside the cells? Perhaps only a small number of those who ascended entered, while the rest remained outside, performing their own activities. This creates the image of ancient groups participating in complex, multi-stage rituals. Some researchers believe that the cells were associated with practices of silence. The space inside is so confined that a person is forced to remain motionless. Any movement produces sound that reverberates off the walls, disrupting the silence. This may have been part of training in attention, contemplation, or even preparation for the role of a priest. In such conditions, a person could hear their own breathing, heartbeat, and the sounds of their own body, leading to a profound sense of inner peace. Local legends include a story about people who could listen to the stone. These people, according to legend, would ascend to Kalpatra to spend the night in a cramped cell, where the stone would speak to them. Of course, this description is symbolic, but it reflects the idea that the cells were intended for contact with nature, its deepest forces. Perhaps the ancient inhabitants of Kalpatra believed that the voices of their ancestors were preserved in the stone, and that staying inside the cells helped them hear them. Researchers recently discovered an interesting detail. Some cells are perfectly oriented to the cardinal points. On certain days of the year, light penetrates through a small opening and falls precisely on a niche in the wall. This may have been related to calendar rituals. However, such coincidences are only a few, and they do not form a unified pattern. This suggests that only some cells were used for astronomical purposes, while the rest served other functions. The stone cells of Kalpatra are a space created not for living, but for inner experience. They resemble stone vessels where a person could remain alone with themselves, with silence, with the breath of the earth. And yet, their creation required colossal labor, lifting the stone, carving the hard rock, creating precise landmarks. Why did the ancient people undertake such a task? Why did they choose these particular rocks? There are no answers. The cells continue to stand among the mountains, watching the sky and the wind. And it seems they were created not to keep a secret, but to remind us that man is capable of reaching for the depths, both external and internal. The mystery of the ritual tablets of Kahir. On the elevated plateaus of Kagir, amidst dry steppes and rocky outcrops, lie mysterious ritual slabs, enormous stone surfaces, carefully leveled and decorated with subtle lines, whose purpose remains unclear. The slabs lie in groups, sometimes forming rectangular platforms, sometimes elongated ovals, but always in locations offering a wide view of the horizon. Each slab is a massive stone slab, as if carved from a single monolith. Their surface is so smooth that it appears polished, although no traces of abrasives or tools have been found. The first thing that strikes researchers is the precise orientation of the slabs. Many are aligned precisely with the cardinal directions, while others are at angles that coincide with the sun's position at certain times of the year. This suggests that the slabs may have been used for astronomical observations. However, their surface lacks any indentations or notches that could serve as markings. Instead, fine lines are visible, sometimes straight, sometimes slightly curved, extending from the center to the edges. These lines may be natural cracks, but their recurrence, parallelism, and direction indicate an artificial origin. Some researchers have suggested that the slabs served as a kind of celestial map on which ancient craftsmen marked the positions of the stars. But if this is true, where is the body of knowledge corresponding to such a system? Kahir is not known as a center of written tradition, and no accompanying texts explaining the slabs have been found. This leads some experts to believe that the knowledge was transmitted orally, using the slabs as a visual aid. Perhaps priests gathered here on certain nights, observed the sky, and compared the visible stars with the lines on the slabs. Another hypothesis centers on ritualistic activities. The slabs may have served as sites for ceremonies related to passages, purification, or the offering of offerings. Some slabs bear traces resembling small, round, and smooth depressions. They are too precise to be natural. Perhaps vessels, objects, or symbols were placed in them. However, such depressions are few in number, and there are no signs of fire or liquids that could have been used in rituals. This makes the theory partial, not complete. One slab, covered in a system of interconnected lines, attracts particular attention. Viewed from above, the lines form a complex geometric pattern reminiscent of a spiral. This spiral is oriented as if leading the eye to a specific point on the horizon. This point may have been important in ancient astronomical observations. However, linking it to known constellations is difficult. The coincidence is only partial. Some experts believe the line indicated the moment when a particular star appeared above the horizon. But if that were the case, why such a complex system? Even more mysterious is the surface of some slabs, covered with thin, almost imperceptible circles. These circles are difficult to see in normal light, but become clearly visible under low-angle sunlight. The circles are arranged concentrically, but their radii are uneven. This all resembles a measurement system based on dividing space into parts. Some archaeologists have suggested that the slabs were used to study the movements of the sun and moon. But why such precision if the people did not have a complex written tradition? The stone from which the slabs are made poses another mystery. It is a dense rock found only in a few places in the region. But this rock is absent from the Kagir Plateau itself. This means the slabs were brought here from another location. Each one weighs over tens of tons. How could ancient people transport such massive masses over significant distances and lift them to the high plateaus? Archaeologists have found no traces of roads, equipment, or temporary settlements necessary for such work. Some slabs have unusual marks on their undersides. These are small protrusions resembling anchor points. They may have served as stabilizers, holding the slabs in place. However, such solutions are extremely rare in ancient architecture. Perhaps the builders used complex balancing techniques to align the surface at a specific angle. However, the lack of written evidence makes it difficult to understand how exactly this was accomplished. There's a theory that the Kagir slabs may have been sites where water-related activities were performed. Some slabs feature barely noticeable grooves converging at a single point. These grooves are too shallow to transport water for practical purposes. However, they could have been used for ritual ablutions, with water flowing over the stone, symbolizing purification or transition. However, there are almost no traces of a permanent water presence at Kagir. The climate is too dry. This leaves the question of the meaning of such rituals open. Of particular interest is the discovery of small stone pillars near some of the slabs. These pillars are too small to serve as supports, but their placement suggests a possible connection to the orientation of the slabs. Perhaps they served as markers or observation points, or perhaps as signs delineating the boundaries of a sacred territory. However, the connection between the pillars and the slabs has not yet been fully explored. One of the boldest hypotheses suggests that the slabs served as a kind of mirrors for light. Their smooth surface could reflect the sun's rays over long distances. If several slabs were connected in a chain, they could transmit light signals. But such chains are not present, or they existed and were destroyed by time. But why would ancient people have needed such signaling systems? For communication? For rituals? For orientation? All the theories pose too many unknowns. There's also a legend that the Kagir slabs were ancestral tables. Offerings to the spirits were made on them, and the lines and circles served as a pattern for communicating with the spirit world. Such legends cannot be scientifically explained, but they reflect the local people's attitude toward the slabs. Respect, fear, a sense of sacredness. Perhaps Cahir truly was a place where people sought to connect with the invisible world through stone and light. Today, the ritual slabs of Cahir remain in place, like sections of an ancient code carved into stone. Their lines, their concentric circles, their smooth surfaces, all speak of the great intention of those who created them. But this intention remains beyond our comprehension, and it seems the slabs don't conceal a secret. They themselves are the secret. Stone spans of Machu. High in the misty Machu Picchu Plateau, where peaks are hidden in clouds and trails serpentine along rocky slopes, lie mysterious stone spans, narrow bridges spanning crevasses and ledges as if connecting parts of a lost world. These spans are so ancient that time has erased almost all traces of their creators, yet the structures themselves are remarkably well preserved. They seem to resist decay, while the surrounding cliffs crumble under the force of wind and rain. Each span is a perfectly calibrated structure of massive stone blocks, laid with such precision that the seams between them are almost invisible. The first thing that strikes researchers is the location of the spans. They are located in places difficult to reach even for experienced climbers. Some spans connect two cliffs separated by deep chasms, while others are so high above the ground that it seems incredible that ancient craftsmen could have carried such heavy stone blocks there. No traces of scaffolding or other temporary structures remain. It seems as if the spans were erected prefabricated. So harmoniously do they blend into the surrounding environment. Each span is composed of stone blocks, worked with astonishing precision. Their edges are straight and even, as if carved with modern tools. There are no traces of mortar between the blocks, but the joints are so tight that even a thin sheet of paper cannot fit through the gap. Geologists note that the stone used in the spans differs from the surrounding rock, indicating that it was specially brought in. But how the blocks were transported remains a mystery. No traces of old roads or mechanical remains have been found nearby. Some researchers speculate that the spans were part of a larger road system that crossed the mountains. However, there are no smooth roads or rest areas. The spans lead not to each other, but into the unknown. They connect sections of rock that bear no traces of settlements. Perhaps the road actually existed, but its traces have disappeared under the ravages of time. Or perhaps the road was spiritual, and the spans were symbols of the journey intended only for a select few. Another mystery is the shape of some of the spans. They are not simply straight, but have a slight curve, perfectly integrated into the horizon. This curve enhances the structure's stability, but requires a high degree of engineering precision. Creating such a curve by hand, without sophisticated tools, is extremely difficult. But the ancient craftsmen of Machu Picchu managed it, as if they possessed a knowledge of the strength of materials that was not preserved in other cultures of the region. Interestingly, thin parallel lines, barely noticeable marks resembling planing, were discovered on some blocks. They run smoothly and continuously across the surface of the block. Such lines are difficult to explain by the impacts of primitive tools. Perhaps the craftsmen used stone or wooden implements, imbued with unusual properties. But achieving such a smooth result would have required years of labor. This suggests that the Machu Picchu craftsmen mastered a unique stone smoothing technique based on gradual abrasion and polishing. One of the most extraordinary features is that the spans withstand incredible loads. Despite the high altitude, strong winds, temperature fluctuations, and earthquakes, they remain virtually undamaged. The stones they are composed of seem to be bound by an internal force that prevents collapse. Some scholars speculate that the blocks are connected by a system of hidden grooves, but no direct evidence has been found. Perhaps the ancient craftsmen used a method in which the stones were fitted so tightly that they formed a monolith. Several small stone platforms were found near some of the spans. They are too small to serve as resting places, but they are positioned as if intended for observation. Perhaps these platforms were part of a ritual in which a person would pause and gaze at the span or the view before moving on. In such places, one senses a special tension in the air, as if the space remembers the footsteps of those who once crossed these stone bridges. It is believed that the spans of Makchupuk had an astronomical function. Some of them are aimed strictly at specific points on the horizon, coinciding with the sunrise on the equinoxes. However, not all spans follow this logic. Only a small number are perfectly oriented, while the rest are arranged in an unobserved pattern. This suggests that astronomical orientation may have played a role, but it was not the primary function. The longest flight, stretching for almost 40 meters, creates a particularly impressive impression, connecting two rocky outcrops separated by a deep chasm. Its surface is slightly inclined, and when walking, it feels as if the flight is ascending, even though the level is beginning to drop. This is an optical illusion created by the landscape. Perhaps this illusion was part of the ancient master's intention. A person walking along the flight felt a symbolic ascent, although in reality, they were descending. Some researchers believe the spans may have served as spiritual crossings. Mountain cultures often feature the concept of bridges connecting the human and spirit worlds. Such bridges don't necessarily have to be actual roads. They can be places where rituals take place. At Machu Picchu, the spans truly appear as boundaries between worlds. On one side are familiar cliffs, on the other, a chasm symbolizing the unknown. But if the spans served as a spiritual center, why are there so few signs of human habitation around them? No fires, no pottery, no jewelry. Perhaps the rituals were held extremely rarely, and participants arrived without objects to preserve the purity of the rite. Or perhaps these rituals were so secret that only a few had access to the spans. Some archaeologists have noted the unusual acoustics of some of the spans. If you stand in their center and pronounce a word, the sound is distorted, as if passing through a subtle resonance. This may be coincidental, but the repeatability of this phenomenon is questionable. Perhaps sound played an important role in the Machu Picchu rites. The combination of wind, stone, and the human voice could have created the effect of the presence of another force. Local legends include stories of spirit bridges that cannot be crossed without a blessing. People said that some spans sing in the wind. These legends cannot be considered historical sources, but they convey the locals' attitude toward these stone structures: fear, respect, and reverence for that which transcends human understanding. Today, the stone spans of Makchupuk continue to stand above the abysses, filled with silence and ancient power. They seem to have been created not by humans, but by the mountain itself, and are merely faced with the stone of human labor. The spans evoke the feeling that they guard a path, but a path to where? Perhaps in ancient times, their purpose was so obvious that it required no explanation. Today, they remain symbols of a mysterious skill, lost along with the people who knew how to connect earth and sky through stone. And it seems that the flights are more than just a road. They are a test of silence, height, and an ancient mystery that makes the heart stop and the mind search for answers where only stones and wind have left them. The disappearance of the Lambu people. Among the parched plains of Lambu, where the earth has cracked from the heat, and it seems as if nature itself has turned its back on these places, there once lived a people about whom almost nothing is known today. Lambu is surrounded by myths, fragments of legends, and rare archaeological finds, preventing a coherent picture from being pieced together. They disappeared so suddenly that researchers still debate whether these people were weak and vulnerable, or, on the contrary, possessed profound knowledge that enabled them to survive in the harsh conditions. The disappearance of Lambu remains one of the most enigmatic chapters of ancient history. The first thing that is surprising is the lack of evidence of destruction. The disappearance of a people is usually associated with conflicts, catastrophes, or gradual decline. But at Lambu, archaeologists found no evidence of fires, weapons, destroyed forts, or traces of violence. On the contrary, the remains of settlements found appear to have departed peacefully, leaving their dwellings intact. In some places, household items, vessels, tools, and jewelry were discovered, neatly stacked and covered in a layer of dust. It seems as if the inhabitants of Lambu deliberately abandoned their homes, expecting to return, but never did. Lambu's architecture is striking in its simplicity. Settlements were arranged around circular platforms paved with smooth stones. These platforms may have served as meeting centers, ritual sites, or trading posts. But what draws attention is their unusual structure. The stones are laid so evenly that they create the effect of a continuous plane. On some platforms, traces of thin lines extending from the center to the edges have been discovered, seemingly dividing the platform into sectors. This may have been related to calendrical observations or ritualistic activities, but the exact meaning of the lines remains unknown. It's also intriguing that the Lambu people possessed sophisticated stoneworking techniques. Their tools, found during excavations, exhibit unusual symmetry, and some pieces are strikingly smooth. However, no traces of quarries or mass production sites have been found. Perhaps the Lambu used processing methods based on the natural properties of stone or had secret workshops located in inaccessible locations. But why their traces are absent, even in the form of fragments or waste, remains a mystery. Another unique element of the Lambu culture were the strange stone rings found in several settlements. These rings, carved from solid rock, are perfectly shaped and of uniform diameter. Some researchers believe they served as symbols of power or belonging. Others suggest the rings were used in rituals associated with the sun or stars. But no image or symbol has been found to explain their meaning. It seems the Lambu rings were carved solely to conceal their meaning. The Lambu trails remain a particular mystery, long, straight lines stretching for many kilometers across the plain. These trails are paved with small stones, and their alignment is so smooth that it seems unlikely for a people without sophisticated tools. Some of the trails lead nowhere. They end on hillsides or disappear into the sand. Perhaps these were roads leading to sacred sites, or perhaps the trails were used for rituals related to the movement of the sun. But the lack of accompanying objects leaves the question open. The most surprising discovery was that Lambu settlements were often located in places where long-term habitation was impossible due to a lack of water. This led to the hypothesis that the people had a method for obtaining water that has not survived. Some researchers suggest that the Lambu created hidden reservoirs or utilized the properties of certain plants. However, there is no evidence of this. Perhaps water had not only practical but also sacred significance for the Lambu, and settlements were located in ritual locations rather than in areas suitable for habitation. Among the few artifacts at Lambu, researchers found small stone tablets with fine lines resembling writing. But if this is indeed writing, it is unique and unparalleled in the region. The lines are too abstract and non-repetitive to be a common system. They could be ritual diagrams, maps, or symbolic constructs. However, the similarity between the tablets from different settlements suggests the presence of a specific tradition. One of the boldest hypotheses suggests that the Lambu people migrated, disappearing not suddenly, but gradually. However, such a migration would have left traces, new settlements, the adoption of cultural elements by neighboring peoples. But not a single known settlement in the surrounding region contains traces of the Lambu. This creates the impression that the people disappeared not through movement, but through dissolution, as if they vanished from the stage of history without a trace. Some researchers believe the Lambu may have been a special type of nomad, spiritual or ritual nomads who spent most of their time on the move. Their settlements, then, could have been temporary centers to which they returned only at certain points. But why were such centers abandoned without traces of long-term use? Perhaps their way of life differed from that of agricultural or warrior cultures. Local legends include a tale of the people of Stone Silence, whose footsteps left no trace. They said the Lambu would leave at night when a thick fog descended upon the land and vanish into it. This is, of course, only a metaphor, but it captures the fundamental feeling that arises when studying the culture. The Lambu people were as transient as a shadow, and their disappearance was as inexplicable as their appearance. One is left with the feeling that the Lambu lived in a world where time and space were perceived differently than we are. Their stone platforms, lines, and rings are like fragments of a language we cannot yet read. They left behind traces too subtle to become history, yet too pronounced to vanish without a trace. The disappearance of the Lambu people remains not just a fact, but a mystery filled with silence, as if the steppe itself holds the secret of those who knew how to live within its harsh breath. Cave complexes of Latmos. Hidden within the rocky gorges of Latmos, where morning mists seem to flow down the slopes like clear rivers, are cave complexes of astonishing scale and mystery. These caves are unlike ordinary natural formations. Their shape is too regular, their passages too linear, and their arrangement of chambers too deliberate for the chaotic workings of nature. A special stillness permeates Latmos, as if the space had absorbed the breath of many centuries and preserved it within its stone depths. The first thing researchers notice is the unusual architecture of some of the halls. They are shaped almost perfectly rectangular or circular, and their walls are so precisely aligned that it seems as if they were carved as a single monolith. In some areas, the stone surface appears to have been smoothed, as if by a special tool, but no tool like this has been found in the region. The marks left on the walls don't resemble the blows of a stone hammer. Rather, they resemble thin, parallel grooves running at a constant angle. This suggests that the ancient craftsmen used a method that was lost over time. A series of small passages connect the central halls with the side chambers. These passages are sometimes so narrow that a person must squeeze through sideways. However, the side chambers themselves are spacious and have unusual acoustics. When a person speaks in one of them, the sound reverberates in a multitude of subtle, soft echoes, as if the walls were composed of numerous thin plates. This acoustic phenomenon is difficult to explain by natural causes. Perhaps the craftsman intentionally created this effect, exploiting the properties of the stone. Some of the Latmos chambers have openings in the ceilings through which sunlight penetrates at certain times of the year. These rays fall precisely on the center of the room, creating a bright circle of light. These chambers may have served as ritual spaces where ceremonies were performed, depending on the position of the sun. When a beam of light touches the center of the room, it creates a sense of the presence of some powerful force, and even modern researchers find this impression difficult to shake. However, not all the chambers are oriented in the same way, suggesting the absence of a unified system. The drawings discovered on the walls of some chambers pose a particular mystery. They depict people, animals, and strange figures with elongated bodies, but are executed in such a stylized manner that their subject matter is difficult to discern. Unlike other ancient drawings in the region, the Latmos images do not strive for realism. They are more reminiscent of symbols, where the idea, rather than the appearance, is important. Some researchers believe these drawings are part of a ritual system in which each element has its own meaning known only to initiates. Another mystery of Latmos is the semicircular projections located along the walls. These projections are of uniform height and spaced apart, as if they served as seats. However, they are too small for comfortable sitting, and their placement is inconsistent with common practices. Perhaps these projections serve to place ritual objects or vessels, but no traces of these objects have been found. It seems as if the complex was thoroughly cleaned before its final abandonment. In some areas of the caves, strange depressions resembling bowls have been discovered in the floors. These depressions are perfectly round and too smooth to be natural. They may have collected water that trickled down the walls during wet seasons. Water may have played an important role in rituals. But then why are such bowls located in places where water rarely flows? Perhaps the bowls served symbolic purposes related to water rather than its actual use. Particularly interesting are the so-called whispering chambers, small rooms where sound is amplified so much that even a quiet breath becomes an echo. When several people are in such a chamber at the same time, their voices merge into a single vibration. This creates the feeling that the space is alive, responding to the person's presence. Perhaps these effects were precisely what ancient people used to create a sense of contact with the spirit world. Some researchers believe that Latmos was not just a ritual site, but also a center of learning. Narrow passages interspersed with spacious halls may have been part of an initiation path. Passing through the dark passages, people faced their fears. Entering the illuminated halls, they experienced relief and exaltation. This path may have symbolized the transition from the material to the spiritual world. However, if Latmos was such an important center, why are there no written records of it? Perhaps knowledge was passed down orally and confided only to a select few. Or perhaps Latmos was a place outside the usual cultural structure, a place of secret gatherings attended by representatives of different peoples. Then the lack of material traces is understandable. People didn't bring household items here, limiting themselves to what was necessary for the ritual. Local legends speak of the deep voices of Latmos, sounds heard in the caves at night. People believed these were the voices of ancestors dwelling within the stone. Sometimes travelers who spent the night in Latmos were said to return changed, calmer and more focused, or conversely, anxious and silent. These legends emphasize the connection between caves and their psychological impact on humans. Perhaps ancient people were aware of these properties and created spaces aimed at promoting inner transformation. Geologists note that the Latmos caves were formed partly naturally, but many elements are clearly artificial. This combination of natural and human labor creates the impression that the craftsmen used natural forms as a base and then refined them to perfection. But why did they abandon the creation of similar complexes elsewhere? Perhaps Latmos was unique to them, a place of power, associated with legends or ancient geological features. The cave complexes of Latmos remain among the most enigmatic sites of the ancient world. They are filled with silence, yet this silence seems to speak. The stone here preserves not only the handprints of the masters, but also the breath of those who came here, hoping to hear answers to life's questions. And today, when researchers stand in the center of one of the halls and listen to the sound recede into the depths, they feel the same sense of mystery as the ancients. Underground corridors of Nimrud. Beneath the ancient ruins of Nimrud, where stone platforms have long since lost their bas-reliefs and the wind carries the dust of those who lived here thousands of years ago across the scorched earth, lies a network of underground corridors that archaeologists call one of the region's darkest mysteries. Discovered by chance during excavations, these corridors resemble neither ordinary storage rooms nor catacombs. They extend to unknown depths, creating the impression that beneath Nimrud existed a secret world, intended not for everyday life, but for activities hidden from view. The first thing that struck the researchers was the structure of the corridors. They are carved into dense rock with smooth walls that appear to have been drawn with a ruler. They are almost uniform in width, and their height allows a person to walk without bending. But in some sections, the corridors narrow sharply, turning into a narrow passageway that can only be passed sideways. Why such narrow spaces in an underground network? Perhaps they served as gates of sorts, symbolizing transitions between ritual levels. Or perhaps these sections were part of a defensive system designed to restrict movement along the corridors. Of particular interest are the circular halls accessed by corridors. These halls have perfectly flat floors and domed ceilings, creating a powerful resonance. When a person speaks in such a hall, the sound reverberates with unusual depth, as if the space itself were picking up the voice. This suggests that the halls were used for rituals involving sound. Perhaps priests uttered words that were intended to be amplified by the stone, creating the effect of an invisible force. Some researchers believe that such acoustic phenomena may have induced an altered state of consciousness in the participants. Barely visible furrows running parallel over significant sections were discovered on the walls of some corridors. These furrows could be tool marks, but they are too smooth, as if drawn across the stone in a single stroke. Given the hardness of the rock, it's unclear what could have made such lines. Perhaps the craftsman used a special leveling technique based on the gradual removal of thin layers of stone. However, such a technique requires a tremendous amount of time and knowledge of the rock's properties, indicating a high level of skill on the part of the builders. Interestingly, in some places, the corridors have small depressions in the floor, perfectly rectangular in shape. These depressions are too shallow to have served as containers for objects. Rather, they may have served as anchors for wooden structures that have long since disappeared. But if there were wooden elements inside the corridors, why are there no traces of them? Perhaps the wood was used only temporarily during construction and then removed. Or perhaps the depressions had a symbolic meaning connected to ritualistic activities. A particularly mysterious section of the corridors is one where the walls are covered with strange marks resembling handprints. These marks are barely visible, but their placement is no accident. They are at shoulder level and form a long line on both sides of the corridor. Perhaps people touched the walls at specific points as they passed. This could have been part of a ritual, a touch as a sign of respect or entry into a sacred space. But why are the marks so thin, as if they were made not with paint, but by pressure? Some researchers believe the stone in these areas was slightly softened, perhaps by moisture or special substances. However, such substances have not been found in the region. A strange phenomenon was discovered in one of the halls. When a person stands exactly in the center, their footsteps create no echo. Elsewhere, the sound is reflected, but in the center, it disappears. This puzzled even acousticians who tried to explain the effect by the peculiarities of the dome. But their calculations don't match reality. It seems the hall was designed with a precise understanding of acoustics beyond the capabilities of modern methods, or perhaps this effect arose by chance and was exploited by the ancient priests. Some corridors lead to dead ends, small stone rooms with perfectly smooth walls. These rooms contain no objects, no traces of human presence, no symbols. Perhaps they served as places of solitude where people retreated for reflection. Or perhaps they were waiting chambers, where ritual participants waited before entering the central halls. But the absence of any traces makes these rooms seem like blank slabs of stone, ready to absorb any meaning. However, not all sections of the corridors are perfectly aligned. In some places, the walls are uneven, reminiscent of ancient destruction. But this destruction doesn't look like the result of earthquakes. Rather, it resembles the marks of a struggle with the stone, as if people tried to widen the corridor, but then abandoned the work. But why did they stop? Perhaps the complex's plan changed, or the builders left without finishing what they started. Or, even more mysteriously, the corridors weren't built in a single generation, but gradually, and their creation was interrupted by unknown events. One of the boldest hypotheses is that the corridors of Nimrud may have served as a subterranean map. Some researchers believe the corridor's structure mimics the arrangement of the stars, with individual turns and chambers corresponding to specific constellations. This hypothesis is too complex to confirm, but it has a certain symbolic appeal, as if the underworld mirrored the heavenly one. In this case, walking through the corridors could have been a ritual symbolizing a journey through the worlds. Another mystery is why the corridors were so carefully concealed. Their entrances are masked, and some are filled with stone. Perhaps the ancients deliberately closed off access to the underworld, fearing that the knowledge hidden there might be misused. Or perhaps it was a rite of closure, the final act of the people leaving Nimrud. but no written evidence of such a decision has been found. Today, Nimrud's underground corridors are illuminated by electric light, but even so, they retain their dark secret. As a researcher walks through them, footsteps echo hollowly, and the air seems still. In such places, one realizes how little we know about the ancient masters. Their skill in working stone, their sense of space and light, their mastery of sound, all of this created structures that continue to inspire respect and awe. And it seems that the corridors of Nimrud don't so much conceal a secret as they are the secret themselves. They are the embodiment of an ancient intention, frozen in stone. All we can do is move forward, listen to the silence, and hope that one day we will understand why this underground world was created. Beneath the shroud of centuries, these mysteries continue to breathe their own life, preserving the silence of ancient worlds and traces of lost knowledge. Each of them is but a fragment of a vast picture that we cannot yet see as a whole. But in attempting to understand the hidden meaning of stone, light, and shadow, we approach secrets that have outlived their creators.